Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of this four-part series on pandemics in the ancient world. My name is Tyler Franconi. I'm a visiting assistant professor of archaeology at Brown University in the United States. Thank you all very much for finding the time to join us today. I know that many of us, not just in the United States, but certainly those of us in the United States, have a lot on our minds at the moment. And thank you for finding the time to be here today with us. I'll introduce today's speaker, Professor Andrew Wilson, in just one moment, but I'd like to first remind everybody about the format of this event. So after a presentation of about 45-50 minutes, we'll have time for some questions and discussion. Again, due to the scale of this event, we'll not be able to turn on video and audio for the attendees. So we encourage everyone to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions for the question and answer session at the end. All right, we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. So please just use that and we'll use it at the end of the presentation. Finally, this presentation will be recorded and posted online afterwards using the Brown University YouTube channel. We'll be sure to post that link on the series webpage once it becomes available. And that should be hopefully within about a week's time. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Andrew Wilson. Andrew is professor of the archaeology of the Roman Empire and a fellow of All Souls College at the University of Oxford. His research interests include the economy of the Roman Empire, ancient technology, ancient water supply and usage, and mining and metal supply, amongst many others. He co-directs and has now for many years, I think it's going on, Andrew, the Oxford Roman Economy Project. And he is also the series editor for the Oxford Studies in the Roman Economy with Oxford University Press. The 16th and latest volume in that series was just published this past September, which Andrew co-edited with Chloe Duckworth, called Recycling and Reuse in the Roman Economy. He also co-directs the Coin Hoards of the Roman Empire project with Chris Howgego, as well as the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa project with Bob Bewley, Graham Phillip, and David Mattingly. He's excavated and surveyed at numerous sites in and around the ancient Roman world, and is currently involved in the publication of excavations at Aphrodisias in Turkey and Utica in Tunisia. Andrew, it's great to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your evening with us. Looking really forward to the talk. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Thank you to everybody else who's managed to join via a successful link. I'm not sure that a talk on plague is necessarily a welcome distraction from either lockdown, which my colleagues in the UK have gone back into, or the compulsive checking to find out who the new president of the US is going to be. But it may be a distraction at least. I'm assuming that many of the people present will have heard Kyle Harper's talk last week, but some may not have done. I'll try not to repeat too much of what he said, but I will have to go over some of the similar background, particularly to make it clear that so much of the evidence that we're going to be discussing is vehemently argued over and is frequently used to support diametrically opposing positions. I've attempted to share my screen. I hope that's now working, and I'm going to carry on in the assumption that what you're seeing now is a PowerPoint, and no doubt Tyler or somebody will tell me if I'm not. So Tyler asked me to talk about the economic impact of the plague, and that really was a question which Kyle last week began to touch on. But to get to the nature of the debate over that, it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves of the evidence we have got, and particularly the sources and the chronology. Immediately we run into trouble if we start to try to reconstruct the chronology, because the chronologically earliest piece of evidence that people have attempted to connect with the plague is Elias Aristides, who tells us in four of his orations that he got the plague in Smyrna. And by the conventional chronology of his works, that appears to have been in summer 165. Or at least he got a plague then. But the plague that we think of as the Antonine plague seems, we're told by most ancient historians who do talk about the origin, to have been brought back with the army coming back from Lucius Verus's Parthian campaign. And it may have broken out as early as 165 at Nisibis, or in the winter of 165 to 166 in Seleucia in Parthia. It seems to have been brought back, we're told, by the returning army. But if that was the case, how could Elias Aristides have got it in summer 165 if the army doesn't come back until winter 165, 166? People have resorted to the explanation that either Elias Aristides got something else altogether, or maybe some people were coming back a bit earlier, but all of that's unclear. 165 Nisibis outbreak comes down to us from Lucian's How to Write History, where he mocks the historian Creperaeus Calpurnianus, whose work is now lost to us, for his account of the plague that broke out, saying that Creperaeus Calpurnianus clearly copied much of that, including its supposed origin in Ethiopia. It's coming down through Egypt from Thucydides. But we don't have to disbelieve the suggestion that there was plague at Nisibis. What is unclear is whether it actually originated in Parthia or whether it originated in Ethiopia, but Calpurnianus may well have cribbed that from Thucydides. Other historians suggest that it escaped from a casket in a temple of Apollo somewhere in Parthia when an impious soldier broke the casket open. And indeed, the fact that its origin seems to be associated with Parthia has led many to suspect that accounts of plague in China at the same time are linked, and that actually the origin may have been somewhere in Central Asia, from where it spread west to Parthia and east to China. Xiphilinus's epitome of Dio 71 says that many soldiers died on the way back from Ctesiphon and Seleucia of disease and famine. By 166, according to Galen, it was in Rome. There is an inscription from Trieste, which tells us in 166 that 21 people of the same household died, but we're not told why. By February 167, I think we can be fairly confident it was in Dacia. I'll come back later in this talk to a document from the mining complex at Alburnus Mile, Rossio Montana, which Duncan Jones has argued, I think correctly, shows that the plague was there. By 168, it was, according to the later chronicler Jerome, in many provinces and in Rome. And it hit the army in winter 168, 169 at Aquileia so badly that the emperors who were there with the army fled. In 168, 169 or earlier, losses due to plague and indeed to other things, including attacks by brigands and apparently population flight, are recorded at Kirkanufis in the Egyptian Delta. So there's social unrest as well in parts of Egypt. Jerome tells us again that in 172 there were catastrophic losses in the army due to plague. And an inscription from Puteoli of AD 174 has the Tyrian traders there writing back to the mother city, Tyre, complaining that because their numbers had dwindled, they couldn't pay the rent on their statio, their trading office. They say, because of the gods and the fortune of our Lord, the Emperor, if there are any stations in Puteoli, our station is better than the others, both in adornment and in size, as most of you know. In the past, this was cared for by the Tyrians settled in Puteoli, who were numerous and wealthy, but now our number has dwindled to a few, and since we pay the expenses for the sacrifice and services to our ancestral gods established here in temples, we don't have the means to pay the station's annual payment of 250 denarii, especially as the expenses for the bull sacrifice at the games in Puteoli have been imposed on us. Unfortunately, they don't tell us why their numbers have dwindled. It's been argued, I think probably correctly, that the plague is perhaps the most likely cause for that. In 174, 175, Marcus Aurelius wrote to Athens, broadening the eligibility for the membership of the Areopagite Council because candidates with 3 generations of citizenship were too few. He mentions disasters that have befallen Athens and other cities which have asked for relief. But again, these are unspecified disasters. Plague is very likely, but it's not explicit. About a year later, in 177, in a debate in the Senate over legislation to reduce the cost of gladiatorial combat, and I'll come back to that shortly, a senator called the plague that pestilence so great that it couldn't be cured by any medicine. In 179, at Socnopaion Nisos, which is this unlabeled dot down here, in Egypt, 1/3 of the population died within a few weeks in January and February of that year. And in 182, at Egstadt, ancient Bediam in Noricum, there's the mention in a funerary inscription of a family dying of plague. Again, the Antonine plague is very likely, but of course, the inscription simply says, per luem vita functi sunt, they died by plague or pestilence. It doesn't tell us what that plague was. Perhaps a more dubious example that's often brought into the argument is an inscription from AD 184, when a Mithraic collegium rebuilt their temple, which had collapsed, and came together mortalitatis causa, for the reason of death, for the cause of the mortality, for the reason of the mortality. It seems from the inscription of names that follow that 5 out of 99 members are dead. I can't understand why in the secondary literature that's generally reported as 5 out of 34. I counted 99 names. But absolutely nothing in that inscription says that is the plague. And then finally in 189, both Dio and Herodian talk about a great pestilence in the reign of Commodus. It's the greatest of those known to Dio. 2,000 people died at Rome in one day. Herodian says that it broke out at Rome and throughout Italy and affected animals and men and was accompanied by famine. Of course, it's not at all certain that the plague of 185 under Commodus is the same thing as the plague under Marcus Aurelius. So all of our evidence is really very frustratingly vague. As I think Kyle mentioned last week, some of the most detailed material comes from Galen, the physician, who gives some symptomology. But for the most part, we have evidence of plague or disease, which we tend to assume is the same plague or disease, and it may well be. But the skeptic can always argue that it's not, because plague and disease were pretty common in antiquity. Another set of evidence has been brought into the argument by Christopher Jones in 2005. It was already known that there's a series of 5 dedications of the mid-2nd century as a result of consulting the Oracle of Claros that are about warding off plague. These are the red squares on the map at Sardis, Hierapolis, Pergamum, Caesarea Troceta, Callipolis, and Odessus. And these dedications include the setting up of statues to Apollo, the archer god, who was thought perhaps not only to have caused the plague when his temple was desecrated, but also could ward it off. Those are definitely associated with plague of some kind. And Jones has associated 11 further texts, these are the red dots, which are inscriptions to the gods and goddesses according to the interpretation of the oracle of Apollo of Claros. These seem to be pretty much the same kind of text and seem to have been set up in response to the same consultation of the oracle, perhaps by the emperor, probably official in some way. And we're not actually told why the oracle was consulted. But again, it's entirely plausible, and the chronology would fit with this, that these are in some way dedications to ward off the Antonine plague. Plausible, not incontrovertible. Finally, and this is perhaps more definitively associated with the plague, the find of a magical amulet in the mud of the Thames at London. This amulet has a text talking about driving away the cloud of plague, and it also includes a hexameter that's clearly a variant on a line that Alexander the oracle monger, the person lampooned by Lucian, is said to have issued at the time of the plague, and people put it up over their doors. And according to Lucian, more people in the households with the slogan over their doors got hit by the plague than in the households without. But the fact that this amulet, talking about driving away the cloud of plague, has a variant of that line, seems to suggest it probably is in response to the Antonine plague. So somebody at London was worried about. Another possible element of the response is that senatorial debate that I mentioned a minute or two ago. This survives in two copies, one from Spain and one from Sardis in Asia Minor. Unusually, we've actually got the text of the minutes of the senatorial meeting with part of the speech of the senator who's introducing the legislation after the emperor has proposed it. The legislation itself is about a reduction of expenditure on gladiatorial shows, capping prices that Lanistae can charge magistrates for different categories of gladiators. But the preserved start of the senator's speech seems to refer to a pestilence so great that it couldn't be cured by any medicine. And it seems that this legislation is perhaps prompted in response to that in some way, a way that's not entirely clear as to whether it's solely economic or is also in some way religious. Later on, the legislation seems to allow for procurators to sell Lanistae condemned men for up to 6 auri, and these condemned men can then be exhibited in the amphitheatre. This specific regulation talks about trinqui that seem to be connected with a Gallic rite of human sacrifice that's perpetuated in the games. This particular subsection of the legislation, it appears, refers specifically to Gaul. And some scholars have then connected that with a massacre of Christians in the amphitheatre at Lyon in 177, described by Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History 521. Eusebius gives absolutely no reason for the outbreak of hatred against Christians. He doesn't feel he needs to. He thinks it's self-evident that Christians got persecuted. But, you know, it would make sense in the context of Christians being blamed for an outbreak of the plague. But again, we're not actually told that. That's the connection with the plague is speculation. Now, I'll move now on to briefly the diagnosis. We've got a rather unpleasant slide coming up, so if you don't want to look at smallpox pustules, look away now. The suggestion that the plague was smallpox goes back to the 19th century at least, and was forcefully argued in 1973 by Littman and Littman. And since then, that diagnosis, retrospective diagnosis on the basis largely of what Galen says about an exanthema or eruption of pustules on the skin, which then scab and fall off, has been followed by many people. But it has been questioned by Gurevich in 2005. She suggested that there's a problem with the smallpox diagnosis because it tends to leave scarring. It leaves very visible scarring, which of course is frequent, for example, in 19th century literature. And the lack of references to scarring of smallpox survivors in either literature or art in the ancient world is perhaps troubling. So Daniel Gurevitz suggested that in fact the disease might have been one of the other pox viridae, one of the members of the same kind of family, but not the variola smallpox virus itself. More recently, Rebecca Fleming has taken that suggestion up, again questioning the identification of modern smallpox. She seems to leave open what the disease might have been. It appears that she envisages that it might have been perhaps the common ancestor of rinderpest and measles before those two diverged in the Middle Ages, or perhaps a variant or ancestor of modern smallpox. And given what we know about the recent evolution of smallpox, even if the Antonine plague was smallpox, it may well have been different from modern smallpox. As Kyle Harper told us last week, modern smallpox can all be traced to a variant that was there in the 17th century, but the modern features of the disease may not be the same as what there might have been, say, 1500 years before that. The closest genetic relatives to the smallpox virus are tatharopox, which affects gerbils, and camelpox, which affects camels, and potentially a zoonosis from either, leaping the species barrier from animals to humans, is thinkable. In other words, then, the disease that caused the Antonine plague may no longer exist in the same form now, with the same symptomology and the same virulence. And the pessimist might therefore say that we can't even take over the known mortality rates from smallpox to estimate the effects of the Antonine plague. Our evidential base is problematic, and that problematic nature explains, I think, the long pendulum swings between extreme positions over its impact. And I'm afraid I need to do a quick literature review now to run over what they are. Back in the 19th century, there were influential historians who were arguing that the Antonine plague had a massive effect. Niebuhr thought that the ancient world never recovered from it. Otto Seeck thought that up to half the empire's population died. Although not everybody agreed. Edward Gibbon, who started his decline and fall of the Roman Empire, of course, with the Antonine period, did not blame decline and fall on the plague. Rostovtsev doesn't give it a large role in his social and economic history. But on the whole, the maximalist view, if you like, prevailed up to the 1950s until the article in 1961 by John Gilliam, The Plague Under Marcus Aurelius, which went over the literary sources, argued that because many of them were 4th century and late, they were unreliable, and that really there wasn't good evidence for a severe impact at all. He thought that it might have killed off maybe 1 to 2% of the population at best, but that's less than the normal death rate. Now, conversely, Lippmann and Lippmann, using the parallel of later smallpox epidemics, preferred a figure of between 7 to 10% mortality for each of the outbreaks in the 160s and 180s. So maybe a cumulative loss, therefore, of between 14 and 20% of the empire's population over the two outbreaks. Now, up to that point, the 1970s, the debate had largely been about demographic impact. How much of the empire did it kill off? But in 1996, there was a revolutionary and fundamental article by Richard Duncan Jones, who argued that it had a profound economic and social impact. And this article pioneered the use of time series proxy data. He looked at a whole series of datable evidence, from year-dated army diplomas to documents, papyri, and series of inscriptions, and argued that all of these data series showed gaps or downturns just at the time of the plague. Now, this article has been much criticised since, but I want to emphasise that it got people thinking in an entirely new way. The problem is that many of these documentary series are fairly general and it's weak evidence for the plague. Building inscriptions at Rome, Duncan Jones argued, showed a gap, but in fact he acknowledged that in other provinces, Spain, Syria, North Africa, they continued in an unbroken series. Maybe the gaps in the Phrygian marble quarry inscriptions, the dated ones there, might be more promising, where there's a break in dated quarry marks at Documæon between 166 and 173, and similarly, while the quarry at Teos has dated inscriptions between 163 and 166, there's nothing from 167 onwards. Duncan Jones stressed regional and even local diversity and suggested that where the plague had hit, it might have had very severe impact, 25% or more mortality, while other regions might remain largely unaffected. Two perhaps promising series of data that he looked at are the areas of plots of land leased in Egyptian papyri, where he showed that after 165, leases on land were for much smaller parcels of land, 8 aruras or less than they had been before, a situation which persisted until the 190s. And this appears to be an avoidance of risk by leasing smaller plots rather than larger ones. And similarly, short-term leases for less than 4 years vanish in the same period until the late 180s. Clearly, landlords wanted to lock tenants into longer contracts, and that might be explicable if there were fewer tenants available. Well, Duncan Jones' article produced a series of follow-ups and responses. The first was a study by Ulrike Emig of Spanish olive oil amphorae, Dressel 20 amphorae, from Mainz, Augst, and sites in northeast Gaul. And she argued that if you quantify those assemblages, there is a dip, but the dip is in the first half of the 2nd century, not the second half where we'd expect it if plague had disrupted trade or consumption in those areas. Now, admittedly, these are not closely dated forms, but the amphora evidence doesn't show any impact of the plague at those in those regions, at least. In the early 2000s, there were a series of debates over the evidence from Egyptian papyri. Roger Bagnall argued that Oxyrhynchus papyri 4527, which appears to show the tax demanded and in Bagnall's view apparently collected in the Heraclides division of the Arsinoite nome in 184 to 185, was apparently the same as it was in the early 2nd century. And that doesn't suggest depopulation. So Bagnall suggested that Egypt's agricultural economy was more resilient in the face of the plague than has been supposed. And he acknowledges that if there was disruption, it was short-term rather than lasting, caused by flight, either from the plague or from tax collectors, because the tax collecting system tried to collect the same tax from fewer surviving people, so the survivors would tend to flee. Bagnall also emphasized regional variation. A year later, Peter van Minnen used exactly the same papyrus to argue the precise opposite of what Bagnall had argued, and read the two sets of surviving figures in the papyrus as the amounts demanded in tax and those actually paid, which in his view fell far short. In 2002, Walter Scheidel proposed a very attractive model of the response to plague that would see real wages rising as the plague provoked a shift in the ratio of land to available labour. And indeed, we see prices rising. But all this suffers from small sample sizes and the further often poor precision of the dated documents, which are often analysed in periods up to 165 and then in the 3rd century, or in the 2nd versus the 3rd century, so periods in large time chunks. And we can't be sure that change that we see in the 3rd century is due to plague in the 160s or even the 180s. And as Scheidel himself admits, increased monetization or inflation might be blamed for the doubling of commodity prices in the late 2nd century. And as Roger Bagnall pointed out in response to Scheidel, the model's really capable of explaining more or less anything because it allows events up to half a century later to be attributed to the effects of the plague. In a sense, more serious challenges to Duncan Jones' articles were levelled separately by 2 different authors in 2003. Greenberg dismissed each of Duncan Jones' proxies in turn, arguing that they suffered from small sample sizes, that if one actually extended the window, the chronological window at which one looked at the data, one could actually see drops in the indices often before 165, and that even in those data which do seem to be disrupted in the period of the plague, a series of military crises and invasions could equally well explain any disruption of the data series at that point. Chris de Bruyn, in the same issue of the Journal of Roman Archaeology, pointed out that Duncan Jones's series of building inscriptions was incomplete at Rome, and there are actually a number that help fill the Antonine gaps there. And such gaps are not unusual in any case if one looks at the whole period from, say, Domitian to the end of the 2nd century. And inscriptions from Ostia, the port city for Rome, which one would also expect to have been affected by plague, show no decline under Marcus Aurelius. So Bruyn argues that those gaps are really an argumentum ex silentio, and the sorts of data series analysed are not well suited to answering the questions asked. He reinforced his argument in 2 further articles in 2007 and 2012, pointing out that the figures used by Scheidel and Duncan Jones for inscription series were wrong, incomplete, and badly used, and then further pointing out in 2012 that much evidence claimed for the plague is not unambiguously connected with it. Now, it's important to stress, though, that although both Bruyn and Greenberg emphasised that in their view the quantitative evidence doesn't illustrate the severity of the plague because it's capable of other interpretations too, the weaknesses in the data series certainly don't argue against the plague, and that's a crucial distinction. I just show you this graph, which was my attempt about 11 years ago to extract a load of building inscriptions from the Heidelberg database across the empire as a whole and graph them as a cumulative thing. This doesn't tell us very much, really, except that the major drop in building inscriptions, and whether you think that reflects building activity or the habit of inscribing, happens in the course of the first half of the 3rd century. Really, and not at the point where the Antonine plague breaks out. In 2012, Elio Locascio edited an important collection of papers on the impact of the Antonine plague, which has some lively debate, no real consensus other than a leaning amongst historians towards the smallpox diagnosis. And then, of course, in 2017, Kyle Harper published his book, The Fate of Rome, that takes an environmental view of the decline and fall of Rome as due to climate change and disease, starting with the Antonine plague, although he does emphasize that the empire was did recover to some extent from it. That's been heavily criticized in a 3-part review by John Haldon and others. I put on the screen the reference to the 2nd part that deals with the Antonine plague in particular, although in the same journal, Harper comes back with a suitably robust response. And then in 2018, Richard Duncan Jones restated much of his 1996 argument in concise form, adding more data series of the same type, and which are all subject to the same objections. And it seems to me almost willfully ignored all the criticism of data and method that have been levelled against his argument in the intervening 22 years. And indeed, a casual reader of that article could in fact remain ignorant of the fact that the 1996 argument had been criticised. But his paper in 2018, The Antonine Plague Revisited, does make 2 important positive contributions. He tries to link climate change to the argument, though noting that the major volcanic eruption in the period that we know about that might have caused climate forcing is currently dated about 168, 169, so too late for the onset of plague, though it may have increased the impact of plague around 170. Importantly, he notes that smallpox thrives better in a cold and dry climate, which would give us something of a better explanation for why climate and plague might be related than the rather weak suggestions that have been voiced up till then that maybe, you know, a cooling climate which caused poor harvests and famine meant that the impact of plague on a weaker was more severe on a population that had already been weakened. The problem with that argument is that if you want to think it's smallpox or something equally virulent, then it probably doesn't really matter how well fed you are. The impact of smallpox on a virgin population with no previous exposure or immunity is going to be fairly devastating, no matter how well fed you are. The other important point that Duncan Jones made in this article was that the strongest new indication of the plague's strength, he said, is the evidence about mining, and that relates to a series of data on lead pollution that had just become available, and which I'll talk about in a moment. So after that slightly dry mechanical literature review, where are we left, if not at some kind of stalemate? A key question is, what is the evidence, what is the impact of climate in all of this? Because many of the indices that have been argued about in terms of the economic impact, particularly those relating to Egypt, are not unambiguously linked to the plague. And a number of years ago, I pointed out they could just as well be linked to climate change. I was inspired by some data which Mike McCormick, Ulf Buntgen, and others, including Kyle Harper, had put together in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History in 2012. And in the conclusion to a conference on environment and climate and so on in the Mediterranean that William Harris had organized, I suggested that their graphing of the admittedly very crude data on whether floods were good, very good, or bad, very bad, etc. in Egypt from Danielle Bonneau's work in the 1970s. Their graphing of those data, which they had argued showed a turn around AD 155 from a predominantly better flood regime to a predominantly worse one, could equally be said to turn round about the early 160s, but actually, irrespective of where precisely in the 150s or 160s you think that that pattern shifts, if we've got a shift in Egypt to poorer floods, no doubt caused by climate change up in the Ethiopian highlands, then that might in itself explain a lot of the problems with tax paying, flight, social unrest. Okay, it wouldn't explain the Pyrus Peth Muis 1, where some people are said to have died because of the pestilential situation, but indeed others there are said to have been killed by raiders, and there's clearly social unrest going on. But a lot of the other papyrological evidence talking about problems with paying tax or talking about people having fled, they could have fled because the harvests have failed and they weren't able to pay taxes for that reason. Now, my suggestion was picked up by Colin Elliott in 2016, who ran with it and made quite a powerful case for climate change and increasing harvest failures in Egypt as behind some of the evidence for social unrest and local violence. The point really is that climate change is actually linked to plague, although we struggle to see how can we disambiguate the effects of climate change and the effects of the Antonine plague when they're happening at the same time. Climate change and plague may themselves be closely linked. Now, this is argued by my student Brandon MacDonald in his thesis and in a forthcoming book chapter, which I recommend to you when it is published. Many of you will be familiar, of course, with the tree ring series showing drops in temperature in the Roman world, or at least in Europe, and there's a similar pattern in the Altai Plateau in the 160s. And Brandon's argument links volcanic climate forcing, including a Japanese volcano that's since been redated to shortly before the plague happens, to nomadic movements in Central Asia and zoonoses reaching Parthia, from which the army could then bring it back to the Roman world. I don't want to say more about that because that's really his argument and I don't want to steal his thunder. But this, I think, provides a much more satisfying nexus between climate change and plague than weak arguments about, well, the effects of plague will be more severe on a population that's already been hit by famine. I want to turn now to some evidence, though, that is clearly or fairly clearly not linked to climate and which is perhaps more plausibly linked to plague more directly. And I want to start with some evidence from Alburnus Maior, the gold mining complex of now Rossia Montana in Dacia, modern Romania. Now here, between the 1780s and the mid-19th century, a series of, in total, somewhere between 30 and 40 wax tablets were found hidden as separate caches of documents in at least 5 and perhaps up to 8 different Roman mine galleries, presumably by different mining contractors. The map shows the different locations of mine galleries marked with this sort of symbol, and not closely located one, number 5 here, in which caches of wax tablets were found. Several tablets were said to be found in the modern San Josef mine, where they broke into ancient Roman galleries. And since quite a few of these were found in different years, some years apart, they're probably not in the same Roman gallery, which is why there could be as many as 8 different groups. But there are certainly at least 5 different groups. They're hidden in different mine galleries, not communicating with each other, and they seem therefore to have been hidden by 5 different mining contractors. And these galleries seem to have been abandoned at the point when the tablets were hidden. Now, the dated documents range in date from February AD 131 to the 29th of May 167, and it's been assumed ever since Theodor Mommsen suggested it in 1873 that they indicate the abandonment of the mines during the invasion of Dacia by the Yaziges and the Vandals in 167 during the Marcomannic Wars, and this is doubtless correct. Now, dark dripping mine galleries are not the usual place to consult or to store documentary archives, and the stashing of documents in the galleries certainly looks like an emergency measure. The mine owners were presumably hiding their documents from the invaders. They may also have hidden themselves. This seems to be supported by a rather curious report of the finding of one of these sets of tablets, now lost, I think, in 1791 in the San Josef mine. A young man named Rakosi is said to have found in a gallery of foul air an old man with a long beard who, when he was touched with his hand, fell to dust. And not far from this old man were 6 tablets. Well, that seems a bizarre tale, but it is worth noting that organic matter is well preserved in these galleries. In the San Catalina Monilesti mine, which is this one here, in 1855, 2 plats of human hair were found with a cache of tablets and other wooden equipment. One of those, a triple plat of fine dark brown hair, 1 foot 5 inches long, is now in Budapest Museum. So it's not entirely impossible that the bearded old man may have really existed. And if so, had he been hiding out in the mine from the Marcomanni? Did they get him? Did he succumb to starvation because he was hiding there for so long? Or did he succumb to the plague? or did he not really exist? But whether or not the bearded man, the bearded skeleton existed, the different caches of wax tablets certainly did. And one of them, again found in the San Josef mine in the area of number 6 on the map, is particularly significant here. It refers to the winding up of a funerary collegium, a burial club, where you pay a subscription to this club, and when you die, they ensure that you are buried with proper funerary rites. These things are known from the army, and there's clearly one in this mining community too. Now, this collegium is wound up and dissolved on the 9th of February 167, because whereas there'd formerly been 54 members, there were now only 17, and Julius, son of Julius, the co-magistrate who'd been elected, presumably in January, when magistrates are normally elected for the year, hadn't arrived at Alburnus Mile to take up his post. Now, of course, we're not told what happened to the missing 37 members of the collegium, whether they were dead or they'd fled, and if they'd fled, why. But it's dated to February 167, months before the invasion of the Yaziges and the Vandals. So although the invasion was probably the cause of the final abandonment of the mines, it can hardly account for the winding up of the funerary collegium in February 167, because most of its members had either died or had fled. Duncan Jones is surely right to see the Antonine plague as the cause of this. So we've got depopulation of the active mining community. It's also worth remembering that one of the reasons why the tribes invade in 167 is precisely because they're aware that the army has been so weakened by the plague, and that we're told that the army had been so badly weakened that the emperor had recruited gladiators and bandits into the legions. Now, more generally, the archaeological evidence from Rossio-Montana, although not always closely dated, oil lamps from abandoned galleries, not shown on this map, but in the König sector here, where several have been investigated by a team from Toulouse under Beatrice Coe. Oil lamps in those abandoned galleries are usually dated no more closely than the 2nd century, but the radiocarbon dates and the dendrochronological dates suggest that most of those abandoned galleries were abandoned in the 2nd century, and there is nothing that needs to be after the 160s in most of those galleries. In 2 or 3 galleries, there is definitely 3rd century material. So some galleries were worked after the plague, perhaps work resumed, but many do appear to have been abandoned in the 160s, and certainly those 5 or maybe 8 different galleries where the wax tablets were cached never seem to have been worked after 167. Now, this is interesting and important because it helps explain some, or it illustrates for us one of the possible mechanisms that would explain a relatively newly reported data series from Greenland ice. Now, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the team led by Joe McConnell at his ice core lab in Reno, Nevada, that worked to produce a 3,000-year record of lead pollution from Greenland ice, mainly from the North Grip 2 core located on Greenland here. It snows frequently, and it usually doesn't melt. So over bedrock, some 3 kilometers of ice have accumulated over the millennia, and these give us an archive going back through time that preserves precipitation and therefore reflects atmospheric pollution over Greenland over time. McConnell's team have developed a method of layer counting that I can talk about in the questions if people are interested, but which enables them to say that we've got accuracy of perhaps 1 to 2 years back in the Roman period. And we have a continuous series. It's subannual resolution. We can see seasonal fluctuation within the ice, and we can pin the chronology absolutely to within a year or two of an actual known calendar year. So the graph that you see shows concentration, and well, it shows the amount of lead deposited, having stripped out an amount for the natural background noise of lead, and there is a steep fall just after the purple band E, which represents the Antonine plague. Just at the point of that band, there is a major drop in the pollution series, which lasts for about 6 centuries before it recovers again in the early Middle Ages. Now, this evidence is not straightforward, because what we're seeing is a site in Greenland that's picking up pollution from it's picking it up differentially according to atmospheric wind transport patterns, but basically it sees more from the red areas and less from the blue and purple and white. What this is basically showing us is that since North America is not producing any lead seriously in the Roman period, and China is not really within the catchment zone, we are largely picking up Europe and the Roman world here, and the blue dots represent known lead mines. The lead pollution is a proxy for lead emissions at source at mining areas. That in turn is a proxy for lead production, and that's a reasonable proxy for silver production, because lead and silver tend to co-occur in the same ores. Now, in many cases, we could suspect that the opening, working, and exhaustion of a mine or mining region would lead to a sort of normal distribution curve for pollution from that mine. And what we're looking at is the superimposition of numerous such curves for different numbers of mines active simultaneously at different periods. But that's further complicated by the fact that they're in different locations, and thus differing amounts of their pollution reach the Greenland ice core site. For a site producing the same amount of pollution, more will reach Greenland from a site in Britain than it would, say, from a site in Spain or the Balkans. But the key point is that overall there's a sharp drop in lead pollution, which kicks in about 166, and that ushers in a period of pollution at much lower levels for about 6 centuries before it reaches mid-2nd century levels again. Here's that in more detail in these two graphs from the supplementary material from our article. You see the big drop at the time of the Antonine plague. Kyle Harper will be interested to see that the absolute nadir in the series more or less coincides with the plague of Cyprian, but of course all sorts of other things are going on in the mid-3rd century too, including breakaway revolts, bits of the empire breaking away. There's all kinds of mayhem happening, so it doesn't have to be just the plague that's causing that. And we have many other dips in previous bits of the record which are not necessarily caused by plague. Recently, an article in this year's Journal of Roman Archaeology applies a statistical analysis to our data and confirms that there is indeed an inflection point in the trend lines, however you measure those, whether by step changes or a sharp elbow bend. But there is indeed a change in the trends around the time of the plague, whether you put that by one method at 166 or another method perhaps more around 174 after the plagues kicked in for a while. It's worth noting that we can see another long-lived drop, which we can be pretty confident is due to plague, with the Black Death in the series. This is from a more recent article where we extend our analysis over time and across a number of other cores. And the complication here is this is a logarithmic scale. But you can, I think, see that there is a long-lived period of over 100 years following the onset of the Black Death in the 1340s that's hitting this record from the Russian Arctic. That's this point here. That drop in lead pollution, we imagine, is caused by a drop in mining activity, both production and perhaps consumption too. Miners dying off or fleeing. It would cohere with other archaeological evidence suggesting that, for example, the mines of Rio Tinto are abandoned between 170, 180. Mines elsewhere in the Iberian Peninsula, certainly the hard rock mines, don't seem to be showing much activity after the 160s, 170s. There's some attempts to revive them, but they don't seem to be working on the scale they were before. But the problem is that archaeological evidence for mining is often very poorly dated. Some other archaeological material, just to draw to a close with, in 2011, Dominic Perring argued that late 2nd century contraction in the occupied area of London is best explained by the effects of plague. He pointed out that at Newgate Street, number 8 here, the structural sequence shows activity up to about 140, 160, followed by a demolition and levelling horizon, over which there was a formation of dark earth characteristic of abandonment, and perhaps also the decay of thatched buildings. Similar sequences were found on the higher ground west of the Walbrook, where buildings fell into disuse around a generation after the Hadrianic fire of AD 125, and the latest stratified assemblages contained pottery of between 120 and 160. So those areas seem to have been abandoned around 160, which wouldn't exclude a date, of course, in the mid to late 160s, because the dating is certainly not precise to the year. The area of Southwark also declined in the period 160 to 170, and the eastern town sees increasing areas of open, unoccupied space in the mid to late 2nd century. He notes that overall there's a dearth of assemblages for the period 160 to 200, and the Verulamium and Highgate wood pottery industries both ceased operation around about 160. Again, that's a crude date. He concludes, therefore, that there's substantial evidence for a drastic reduction in the population of London in the mid-2nd century, and that much of that evidence centres on the period 160 to 170. London wasn't abandoned, but it contracted appreciably. And importantly, though, he also points out that there was some new construction during this period of temples and shrines in particular, including a temple in Tabard Square, that's number 1 to the south of the Thames, apparently to Mars Camulus, built on epigraphic evidence between 161 and 169, and a temple precinct near the Thames on the southern slope of Luggate Hill, dated shortly after 165 on dendrochronological ground. So, and perhaps other temples to the south of the amphitheatre belong to this period, and on the west banks of the Walbrook and the Fleet. So Perring explains the apparent contradiction between a contraction of the occupied area of London, with abandoned houses not rebuilt, and the construction of new temples in the period 160 to 180 as a response to the Antonine plague, seeking divine favour and protection. North of London at Verulamium St Albans, there's also evidence for contraction, but the situation here is complicated by the effects of a fire in the Antonine period around 155. It is, however, significant that the buildings destroyed by fire were usually not rebuilt, but left as empty plots, some for up to half a century, and that may suggest population loss. Perring also notes that a wider tendency in the course of the later 2nd century in Romano-British towns is the replacement of smaller timber houses by larger masonry-footed townhouses. The reasons are unclear. Alternative explanations are possible, but that trend would cohere perfectly with the consolidation of properties into larger plots as the survivors of plague brought up, took over, or expropriated abandoned buildings. And he notes that some other cities display a similar trend. Milan, with a hiatus in building activity that started in or around the middle of the 2nd century, and Beirut. And of course, there is notoriously the mass grave from Gloucester in Britain, a grave found in a cemetery outside the settlement around the Roman fortress at Gloucester, Roman Glavum, published in 2008, a mass grave with some 97 or so bodies thrown into a pit. They were clearly all articulated when they went in. Limbs were tangled together, so they all went in at one time. There were no trauma marks or wounds on the skeletons, so it's not a massacre. and all the indicators are consistent with this being a plague pit, a mass burial when normal methods of body disposal are broken down. The dating, such as it is, suggests a period in the mid to later 2nd century, not the 3rd century, and the excavators cautiously suggest a connection with the Antonine plague. That seems highly plausible, indeed overwhelmingly likely to me, but it's not 100% certain. So to sum up, where are we? I mean, I don't think anybody doubts that there was a severe plague in the 160s and the 180s, and that maybe indeed that chronological evidence that I went through at the start could all belong to the same pathogen recurring in various waves, though that in itself isn't absolutely certain. The Antonine plague can't, I think, have been as severe as the Black Death of the 1340s. We don't have the equivalent in the Roman world of deserted medieval villages, DMVs. We don't even seem to have the equivalent, it seems, of entirely abandoned towns, as has been suggested for some sites in the Levant, where the last material on the extramural rubbish dumps belongs to the mid-6th century, and these may have been abandoned as a result of the 6th century Justinianic plague. I've talked about a contraction in the size of London, but it's not abandoned. So mortality of 50%, even 40%, as might be expected for the medieval Black Death, should lie well above the upper limit of Antonine plague mortality. As I've said, though, we appear to see the shrinkage of some towns like London and the abandonment of some mining areas, and a real considerable drop in lead pollution, reflecting, I think, lead production and silver production. Yet that sort of decline isn't apparent everywhere. It's not apparent in, for example, North Africa, and around the early 3rd century, the North African Christian writer Tertullian could say, ubique domus, ubique populus, ubique res publica, ubique vita, summum testimonium frequentiae humanae, honorosi summus mundo. Everywhere dwellings, everywhere people, everywhere cities, everywhere life. The greatest testimony of human numbers is that we are burdensome to the world. So if North Africa had been hit by the plague, it seems to have recovered a generation or so later. Overall, mortality of maybe 10 to 20%, with regional variation, including considerably more in some cities and less in densely populated rural areas, seems to me entirely plausible if the disease was smallpox or smallpox related. But, you know, of course, if we're dealing with a smallpox related ancestor of modern smallpox, we don't know that the mortality would necessarily be the same as smallpox. Many of the proxy indicators that people have tried to deploy in the debate are problematic. They could be explained by the plague, but they're also capable of other explanations. The one I think most clearly shows a relationship with the plague is the lead pollution graph, which I've said is a proxy of lead production and mining in the Roman world, and a reasonable proxy also for silver production. But the whole problem is complex. Several things were happening at once: plague, climate change, many wars, and there's a problem of disentangling the effects. But in fact, the causes are entangled too. Climate change may have facilitated plague, warfare facilitated its transport, plague facilitated further warfare as the Marcomanni and other Germanic tribes saw their chance against a weakened army with opportunistic invasions. The evidence doesn't always easily allow us to separate the effects of those different causes, and in fact we need always to keep in mind that they are interlinked, and that the process of late 2nd century change that we can observe in some provinces more than others was multifactorial. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that talk with so much interesting and frustratingly complicated data series to think about. I wonder, well, first I want to again encourage all of our attendees to submit any questions that they may have through the Q&A. We've had a few come in already, and so please do ask more. We have time. We have at least until 1:30 here, I think. So we have time for a few questions, and anything that we don't get through live, I'll be certain to send to Andrew separately so that he has a chance to review what people are wondering about. Andrew, I wonder if I might start by just asking for a few more of your thoughts on why if we think that a large percentage of the lead pollution that you see drop in Greenland is coming out of Spanish sources, why do we not think those mines were ever reopened in a significant way later in the Roman period?
Right, thank you. Well, I mean, some of that is coming out of Spain, but quite a lot of it is coming out of Britain and more northerly sources too. I don't know if on the feed or not.
It is.
Good, then I'll go back to that distribution map. So, I mean, a key point to reiterate is that the British mines here and even the northern Spanish mines will be seen orders of magnitude greater than the rather more numerous Spanish mines here. So both sets are feeding into that pollution signal, but Britain is, if you like, overrepresented with respect to Spain. And Duncan Jones also points out one of his data series are dated lead pigs from Britain, which stop in the 160s. And that could be that they've stopped producing lead. It could also be a change in recording habits. Why were the Spanish mines not reopened on the same scale? Well, many years ago, I suggested that it may have been to do with problems of deep mining, and that if you're mining below the water table and then you allow the mine to become flooded, it's not really possible with ancient dewatering devices to keep an entirely flooded mine in which you need to be rotating your wheels dry, whereas it is possible if you keep up with the flooding as it comes in. Maurice Silver took issue with that explanation and pointed out that perhaps a better explanation, and he might well be right on this, is that the plague changed labour costs. With fewer surviving miners, labour became more expensive, and it becomes uneconomic to dig deep shaft mines in some of those deposits. That's perhaps a better explanation. It may be a combination of the two. I think we shouldn't, I mean, in a sense, this is an extension of Silver's argument. It's clear that deep underground mining required skilled labour, and it's clear from the evidence at Rossio-Montana that some of this was wage labour. From Dacia more generally, we can see the movement of miners from Dardania into Dacia under Trajan. So this isn't all criminals and slaves. If there was significant population loss, then a shortage of miners, skilled miners, not only pushes the costs up, but also actually has a cap on the available useful labour pool. So it could be a combination of those factors. We do hear of a restitutor metallorum, a restorer of the mines at Vipasca, Aljustrel in Portugal in the 170s. We don't know what measures he was undertaking to restore them, and whether that could, for example, have involved more attractive leasing terms. We know that the mine shafts at Vipasca were leased.
There are a number of other questions, particularly focusing on the lead pollution. So I'll go through a few of these. Mm-hmm. Aaron Bentley, one of our graduate students here, asks whether if the drops in lead pollution are possibly caused by plague events, what are the causes of short-lived spikes in pollution during this period, such as between the plagues of Cyprian and the Justinianic plague? Are these signs of possibly reopening of either old or new mines in this region?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the spikes show opening and intensive exploitation of new mines, and we may, in some cases, for individual mines, be looking at relatively short lifespans, maybe 10, 20 years, maybe 30, maybe more. We're frequently not sure, in fact. But if you think that what we're seeing is the superimposition of a signal over time from multiple sources, many dozens across the Roman world that are active simultaneously, but over time, you have to imagine some of those blue. I mean, if you were to do a sort of time series video of these mines, the blue dots that are in action at any one point, they'd be blinking on and off. Our signal is, I think, a superimposition of signals from each of those mining sources. And you might expect a sort of normal distribution curve for each, quite a steep normal distribution curve, ramping up to peak production and then tailing off. Superimpose several dozen of those that are differentially distributed in time, and you get the overall sequence we've got, but further filtered by the fact that more northerly ones are better represented. Now, I think some of the big peaks we've got here are the openings of new mines in Spain and even Britain. Some of these 1st century AD spikes may be British mines. But at the moment, we can't yet say which spikes are which sets of mines. We are in the process of trying to do some lead isotope work on meltwater that we preserved from the samples that may help us see if there are skews over time towards different isotopic signatures, characteristics, say, of Britain or Germany or Spain. But I think the spikes are different mines, different mining regions, and in some cases it's the exhaustion of those regions. In other cases, it's the abandonment. In the case of Rossio-Montana, which I should have emphasized is a gold mine rather than a lead-silver mine, though there are silver concentrations too there. The Toulouse team found that ore samples in some of the abandoned galleries are still very rich in gold, and it doesn't seem to be the case that those mines had been worked out. And indeed, some gallery faces which just stop abruptly at a dead end look as if they have been abandoned mid-work, as it were. Now, in the case of the ones abandoned in the 2nd century, the obvious context for that is the Marcomannic Wars. In the case of the ones that were worked in the 3rd century, the obvious context would be the Roman withdrawal from Dacia in the 270s. So Rossio-Montana gives us an illustration of how some of those processes might have worked, but I should emphasize that it's not Rossio-Montana that's contributing to the lead signal as much as the lead-silver mines would. It's important to notice that there are quite a cluster of lead mining sites in the Balkans that should be being picked up at about the same level as the Spanish mines. So, and what we know of archaeologically about those suggests 2nd to 3rd century activities. So some of this stuff could be Balkan. We might be able to get at that a bit by further analysis of the record from the Russian Arctic, which is the black line here, but rather unhelpfully on this longer durée graph shown on a logarithmic scale to compare the Industrial Revolution with antiquity. On a simple scale, the vertical scale will be so extruded that you wouldn't see the ancient fluctuations much. But the point is that the Russian Arctic core sees this area, the red and the yellow, much more than the Greenland cores do. So we could, by looking at the differential between our Russian Arctic signal and our Greenland signal, which is the purple here, begin to see that there are certain peaks that show up in one record and not the other. And if they're better represented, say, in the Balkans, or at least if they're better represented in the Russian core than in the Greenland core, then there's a greater chance there from places like the Balkans or Britain.
Building on that, and I guess just a point of clarification, though maybe one that's really hard to get at. Stella Rendina, I don't know if that's you. If it is, hi, asks about the influence of wind patterns delivering this pollution to the glacier sites where you're able to take the cores. And I think the question must be, how can you account for the changes in air circulation patterns that would affect the deposition of this pollution, rather than just looking at patterns of pollution as if it was a constant deposition?
Yeah. Okay. So the model that we used was developed by our Danish collaborators, led by Andreas Stoll, who developed this FlexPart emissions modeling system, which looks at air mass transport, air circulation. And that can be run in forward mode. You can either say, well, I've got a mine at this particular location, where's its pollution going to go over the next weeks and months? Or in backward mode, I've got an ice core here, what's it seeing? Now, the data they used to feed into that was half a century or so, I think, of 20th century or sort of recent climate data. And I suppose, therefore, does reflect essentially modern air mass transport patterns. And of course, the question arises, is this susceptible to climate change in the past? I think you'd need major changes in Northern Hemisphere wind patterns, which I don't think, but I'm not a climate expert, I don't think those are likely in the course of the sort of temperature and rainfall fluctuations that we can extrapolate for the past. But it's a good question, and obviously there is interannual variability. But the point is that we can see seasonal patterns in the deposition in Greenland, which remain fairly constant and which allow the layer counting. That's done by concentrations of ceruleum, which is present across the Earth's crust and is in airborne dust, and that shows steady seasonal sort of sine curve fluctuations, which, together with non-sea salt sulfur and some other things, allows the team to sorry, not non-sea salt sulfur, oxygen isotopes and so on, allows the team to count annually backwards. And I don't think we see that seasonal pattern changing substantially. So climate scientists will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that climate change is going to be an explanation for a sudden 6th century long drop in Greenland lead pollution.
I guess it would be interesting to have that discussion with climate scientists and see if actually the data that you've collected could be turned around to ask different climate questions on their behalf, right? And see if that can contribute anything to ideas about long-term variations in, say, the North Atlantic Oscillation or something like that, if it lines up.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there is a whole host of other data that have been collected by Joe McConnell's lab. We were looking not only for metals, but oxygen isotope data, black carbon, all sorts of things, dealing with both atmospheric pollution, volcanic eruptions, which speak, of course, to volcanic climate forcing, and lead pollution. And indeed, McConnell's team and collaborators, particularly Michael Siegel, have done a lot of important work on volcanic climate forcing. And the well-dated ice core stuff, at least in the last few thousand years, allows us to date some pretty major eruptions, particularly now they've actually worked out how they can synchronize the ice core chronologies with the dendrochronological record.
Let's see. How about, we have another question here, and keeping an eye on the time, I think we have time for maybe one or two more before we wrap up. But there's a question here that moves us away from the metal discussion and pollution to ask about other kinds of archaeological proxies. This comes from Sedat Kush, who asks, what might we think about the effects of the Antonine plague on pottery trade and manufacture? In the West Anatolian coast, it seems that African red slip wares disappear from the scene around this time. Could that be connected to plague? Thank you very much. Your thoughts?
Thanks. No, that is a very good question. And of course, I mentioned a couple of the British pottery industries that seemed to cease around then. One thought that occurred to me while preparing this talk, but I'm afraid which I didn't have time to follow up on, is indeed whether changes in the dating of pottery forms might well be correlated with the plague, i.e. because some workshops go out of use, and even if other workshops producing African red slip ware continue, do they introduce new fashions? Is that a point of rupture at which forms change? Kyle Harper showed us last week a graph from the very recent publication of the Tiber Valley Survey reanalysis, the book on Rome's Northern Hinterland by Helen Patterson, Rob Witcher, and others. He showed us a graph of amphora finds graphed over time using a probabilistic method of amphorae per year. Now, such graphs are very heavily influenced by the dating one gives to particular forms. And Harper noted a point which the original publication hadn't noted, that there was a major drop in numbers of certain kinds of amphorae, though admittedly many of them fairly long dated forms, just around the time of the plague. Questions arise there. Is that because there are fewer amphorae being traded? Is it, and indeed less of the goods that have been traded in those amphorae being traded as a result of the plague? Is it because some of those workshops, amphora producing workshops, have gone out of use because the potters have died or fled? And are they being replaced by the same wine, but now in barrels? All of these things are frustratingly vague. We have a problem of equifinality where the same results could be achieved by a variety of different routes. It is definitely worth looking into disruption of pottery production and indeed trade. So whether it is disruptions in supply or even variations and changes with the cessation of some kind of pottery forms, the new introduction of other forms in the same wares, or indeed the cessation of entire pottery classes, entire wares, which would indicate disruption at the production end, or whether it's an issue of pottery supply, indicating disruption in trade. There's clearly work to be done on that front. That's a very good question, so thank you for it.
Maybe just as the last question here, Andrew, just to bring back another category of evidence that you referenced early on in your talk. We have a question here from Mark Boimer, referring back, I think it was to one of the oracular texts that you had up early in the talk, asking about the Latin terminology used in the phrasing. The last sentence translated as God and man. In 177 AD, Christianity was not yet a legal religion. In Latin, it seems to mention multiple divinities with in small letters. Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Are we talking about the Dies Diabusque Oracle of Claros inscription? I think we might be. So this is to the gods and goddesses. Roman pagan religion was not monotheistic. These are altars which are dedicated to plural and unspecified gods and goddesses. Whether this was conceived of as mainly the Olympian gods or indeed impossible gods, is not clear. But this is evidently more than just to Apollo. You know, one could view this as a sort of scattershot dedication to ensure divine favor from them all, and make sure none of them was left out in you know, what is perhaps a very desperate situation.
Right. Sorry, Mark is clarifying that maybe it might be on the slide before this one, what the text that he's referring to.
Maybe is it that the transcript of the debate in the Roman Senate?
Of God and Man. Yeah, I think that must be the one based on the
right.
last. Sorry,
yeah.
Mark. It's hard to do this between.
Yeah. Okay, so this is this is not my translation. I simply gave you the translation from Oliver and Palmer's Hesperia article. So it's actually really, it's to all divine and human laws, to all laws both divine and human, is what a better translation of that would be. But yes, absolutely right to pick up on the poor translation there, and the fact that indeed we should not be talking about monotheistic religion, just as we're not actually talking about man, we're talking about human laws and divine laws.
Well, maybe thank you for that clarification, and it certainly seems relevant in 2020 right now to think about asking all the possible gods that we can for help and assistance in getting through these times. So maybe we can relate to that more than we would have about a year ago or so. I think that we can probably end the questions there and let Andrew off the hook. Andrew, thank you so much again for a really interesting talk and some really good questions and answers afterwards. It was great to have you, so thank you for your time. I'm sure all the attendees are applauding for you at home. And I would like to just say to all of our attendees, and Andrew to you as well, that I hope that you'll be able to join us next Tuesday for our next talk, which will be given by Hunter Gardner, talking on Quisquamne Regno Gaudet, Politics and Plague in Seneca's Oedipus, something that again might have strong echoes in our modern 2020 context. So Andrew, thank you all to the attendees for coming. It was a pleasure. We'll see you again next week.